Hello everyone, I'm Sam Clift, and in this colour pencil tip video I'm going to be showing you how I drew this Satsuma in colour pencil. I hope you enjoy the video. In this video I'm going to be showing you how I created a smooth Satsuma, blending through all of the different colours and getting rid of that graininess in the paper. If you wanted to see how I created the segment, then if you have a look at the cards above, I will list that video. But I'm just adding a layer of Luminance colour pencil, and I'm using small circular motions all over the area that I know is going to have this colour in it. So there are sections in it that are going to be even more highlighted, so I'm leaving those free, but most of those are at the top, and a lot of the highlights are actually lots of different colours. There's lots of yellows and oranges, but I know that the base that I put down here is absolutely fine. It's a light colour. So I'm just using circular motions to build up the layers. It's going to take quite a lot of layers. This is Fabriano Artistico hot press watercolour paper, and so I know that it does take quite a lot of layers before you run out, before you flatten the tooth of the paper. So I'm just going in with a Polychromos now. I'll list the colours in the description box below, but you can see I'm using big circular motions because I know that I'm going to be going over this area lots and lots of times. So I'm not too worried at this stage about the stop and starts. I know that that will get covered up later on. So just going over the whole of the area that I know has got this colour in it, and it does take quite a few colours to get the richness of the orange that I'm going for. It's not just orange, there are lots of yellows, there's lots of reds. So I'm just mapping out the highlighted areas to make sure that I leave those out and I'm not colouring those over. Because colour pencil is notoriously difficult to lift up once you put it down, so I'm making sure that I'm preserving those and leaving the white of the paper showing through, and then I can go back to those areas a little bit later on and just fill those in a little bit. So there you can see big circular motions just going around the highlights, and now I'm starting to add the layers on top of the previous. I think I went over it with the Luminance colour pencil, which is really quite a good pencil to use for a base, a couple of times. There's about 2 layers down. This is the 3rd layer, and I'm going over the areas a couple of times with this one as well. So you can see circular motions again, big oval shapes, just being a little bit more aware of the stop and start. I don't want to scribble, go back and forward, because then you will definitely get darker parts and lighter parts, which you don't want. I'm also tidying up the edges to make it nice and crisp. Otherwise, it does look a little bit unfinished if you don't pay attention to those details. Just going in with the yellow now. This is really to blend those colours together and to add a little bit of a sunnier, warmer tone to the orange, making sure that I'm watching my reference photo, balancing out the colours well, and then just going over the areas that I know that's got this orange, going in with a darker orange now. And you can see it's starting to lose the graininess now. It does take quite a long time to do, so bit of perseverance, patience, don't rush it, because otherwise you probably will end up scribbling and going back and forth, and then it just looks a little bit messy. So there you go, those circular motions again. In with the Luminance. The Luminance are good after a couple of layers to blend them all together. They're wax based, so they're really good for that. They will get rid of all of the graininess and they add a really lovely pigment. There's also lots of lovely colours available in this set as well. So you can see now that I'm not just going over the whole area with one block colour. If I just went over the whole area, it would be really flat and you wouldn't create that depth and the 3D look. I'm constantly looking at my reference photo to see where the shadows and the highlights are, and then applying the colours to that and leaving other sections free. Maybe there's only 3 or 4 layers, and some areas there are going to be 6, 7, 8. So just going into the shadow part now of the Satsuma and making sure that the bottom part is as dark as it needs to be, and that is going to take a lot more layers of the orange Luminance pencil there. I'm just tidying up the bottom as well because that was starting to look a little bit grainy and very unfinished. And then paying attention to the darkest parts, there's going to be shadows that are created from the other parts of the Satsuma leaning, the segments leaning up against the whole Satsuma. So I'm making sure that I'm adding those colours and then they will pop forward and create a 3D look. This section here, I noticed that it's quite a triangular section of shadow. And also there's lots of different textures to the skin of the Satsuma. So just bearing that in mind and trying to get those colours in as well. I'm going in with the Caput Mortuum now, which is a Polychromos, and that's fantastic for getting realistic shadows. If you look on the colour wheel, then the purples are opposite the orange, which is a really great, it means complementary colour. It's great for adding shadow and it looks more realistic. If it went in with a black here or even a grey, it would just look really strange. It would look like cartoony going in with a really dark colour. So the violet is really great for that. So just adding quite a few layers to this. This paper will take it, and it looks really quite dark there, but it's still the Caput Mortuum violet. And just making sure that I make those shadows as dark as they need to be. And what you find then is that the segment will start to pop forward and the Satsuma will start to go back into the background. Going in with the Luminance cream now just to blend that kind of lighter area. And you can see it's taken a while, but it's starting to take a bit of a 3D shape now. Looking a little bit more like a sphere as opposed to just a flat drawing. And as you get used to the colours that you're using, you know, you've probably pulled all of the ones out that you're going to be using, you get a bit more confident, and then it's muscle memory, isn't it? You start to remember which order you laid those colours down. And so that's the process that you need to then go follow forward for the rest of the drawing. So I've got that block colour in. You can see the oranges I'm using there. You can see the block colour. And now I'm thinking about that top section, which has lots and lots of different highlights to, you know, the light source was coming from the top and there were shadows that were created from the dents and the ripples and, you know, that little tiny bit at the top that the stem comes out of. I don't know what that's called. Oh my goodness. Mental block. But yeah, making sure that I add all of those shadows in and get all of those tiny details in. At the moment, what I'm going for is a kind of a uniform, smooth-ish finish to the Satsuma. But where the light hits it on the top is where you can really see the texture, which is actually not very smooth. It's very bumpy. It's got lots of little dots and dents in it and little spots all over. So that's where you'll see the detail of all of the texture. But I'm just making sure that I'm going back and forward. And until you've got certain sections in, it's difficult to tell how dark you need to go, or if it's looking a bit too yellow or a little bit too red instead of the orange. Once you've got the other sections in, you can really start to see, because tone is relative to what you see around it, and until you've got other parts in. It's very, very important to build up in layers so you don't go in with a really heavy hand in one colour, because you'll flatten the tooth of the paper and then you won't be able to add any other layers on top. And I think the importance to getting something to look like it's got depth is layering. It's about laying one colour on top of the other, blending them together and creating these kind of little tiny toned nuances, these, you know, subtle changes in the colour, which makes a massive difference to the end result. So going in with the yellow again, there are some lighter parts in the top of the Satsuma. It's not just white highlights, there are some yellowy parts and some much darker oranger, is that a word? Orangey parts. So going in with the cadmium orange in the Polychromos. and just taking my time at the top here, adding the detail in, and tiny small circular motions in the bigger areas, and then in the smaller areas I'm doing tiny scribbly motions to suggest that detail, suggest the texture of the top. The highlights aren't just blocks of white, they're not triangles or squares, there's lots of different colours within the highlight, so it's important to add those in too. Once I'm confident that I know this is a block colour, I can go over and start layering up again, pressing a little bit harder with each layer, just watching that you don't press too hard. It's kind of like a medium pressure here. Start it off very lightly and then building up the pressure. So towards the end, I definitely was burnishing, which means flattening the tooth, pressing a lot harder, just to smooth the paper and get rid of all of the graininess, which makes it look a bit like crayon. So again, this part here is a kind of more of a one colour. When I say one colour, it just means that it doesn't have lots of highlights in, it's just lots of layers of orange and yellow. Just making sure that I leave out the edges of the segment. I don't want to smooth it off and make it look too uniform, because that's not really how real life is. There's usually little bits that aren't, you know, in a pet portrait, the flyaway hairs are what give it the detail at the end. And it's the same with anything else, you know, you having the tiny little, not mistakes, but all of your little details make all the difference to the final result. So just, you can see there, I'm using that scribbling motion in the highlights at the top. And just watching the reference photo, making sure that I'm not adding too dark a colour in where there isn't any. And there you go, I've just added that little top section, and then I can then work out how dark the shadows need to be around that to really make it look like it's popping out. I'm going in with that Caput Mortuum colour again, because that's a fantastic one for adding shadow. And just making sure the shadows are as dark as they need to be. Creating that depth and texture. Otherwise it will look a little bit flat. Once I've got that dark top part in, I can see that I need to darken up the shadows created by the segments a little bit more. So I go in with some more cadmium orange and go over. See, this paper is taking so many layers, and as you get to know the papers, you'll kind of get to know how they work. You do need to adapt your techniques to the different papers and also any different pencils that you use. So I'm blending those colours, I'm making sure that they kind of are cohesive, I suppose. They don't look like a block of shadow, then a block of highlight with no transition in between. That wouldn't look great, it would look too disjointed at this stage. So I'm just making sure that I'm adding those midtones to even everything out and give it that kind of joined up, cohesive look. So I'm using a lighter hand now with this Caput Mortuum because I'm glazing over the top of lots and lots of different layers. So I'm definitely not pushing too hard. I just want a hint of this colour. I don't want it to be a massive shadow. So very light hand, and then building up the pressure as I go into the really dark sections, but only in those really dark sections do I really push hard. Just tidying up these parts here because they just looked a little bit separate to each other. There was quite a dark shadow on that edge, and then lighter parts towards the middle and definitely at the top. Just going in with the Caran d'Ache Luminance to kind of blend all of those scribbly bits together so that they aren't as disjointed. They're not just blocks of highlight and blocks of shadow. Adding the midtones to pull those together. And then once I've got the highlights in, I can see that I need to go darker still in those midtones, adding a little bit more orange and giving it some vibrancy. Again, glazing over, going in with the cream into the highlights because they're very, very rarely just white. They've usually got a few different colours in between, darkening up the creases at the top to make sure that they are dark enough. And just carefully going around the highlights with that cadmium orange, making sure that I'm adding those midtones in where they need to be. And blending the shadows as well so that it's not such a massively crisp line, it's all blended nicely. Constantly checking back to my reference photo and adjusting where necessary. I can see now that I need to add a little bit more shadow where the segments are to make sure that they pop forward and the whole Satsuma is pushed back to create that depth in the picture. I've added a little bit more orange to the segments to make those pop out, and then I can tell which elements need to have attention, and adding a little bit more to the highlights. Blending once more, adding a few final details. And the Satsuma is complete.